In the first video for Chapter 10, we talked about the idea of externalities and negative externalities. We talked about negotiation and the Coase theorem as ways to address the problem of negative externalities. I mentioned then that there were two other ways, adjudication and legislation. We'll talk about those here in this second video. I do, for this one, however, suggest that you have a copy of the PowerPoint handy. I'm going to talk about, once we sort of, the lead-in from adjudication and legislation will lead us to talk about three ideas in environmental economics that I think are important and interesting and really aren't covered in the book in any sort of deep systematic way. So you should probably have the PowerPoint with you. There's at least one graph in the PowerPoint that we're going to want to take a look at as well. So negotiation, right? Parties to the externality get together and try to solve that, turn that externality into an exchange. If property rights are clear and clearly defined, transaction costs are low. But if they're not, there's other ways, right? So, for example, when property rights are unclear, we might need to use the legal system to figure out who has them. And this is what we call adjudication. Now, it's important to understand with adjudication that this is where the courts, judges, are discovering who has the rights, not creating new rights. So one way to think about this is that the right exists. The answer to the question, who has the right, here exists. Is it the motorcyclist or is it the residents, right? It might not be clear to them as they try to figure it out. So they might have to go to court to figure out, in fact, who does have the right. Right, so sometimes, again, we need the courts to figure out, finding a property line on a map or something more complicated, like who has the right to quiet versus the right to start their motorcycle. But again, the right's out there. The court just has to figure out who it is, and it may be that some sort of change in technology or other circumstances has made it less clear. Right, you can think about intellectual property and music sharing and all these kind of things. What are the rights of artists? What are the rights of music consumers to copy their work, right? All of these things in the sort of digital technology has brought to the fore in ways that it hasn't before, okay? And the key to all of this is the importance of precedent, right? And the continuity of expectations. What judges try to do is find out what expectations people should have had and uphold uphold those expectations, right? That if people should have expected that the motorcyclist has a right, then that's what we want to uphold. And precedent means going back to the earlier cases and figuring out what the underlying principle or rule is and trying to apply it to this case. If similar cases have found with the cyclist, with the motorcyclist, then his expectations that he could fire it up at any time are legitimate and valid, and he's got the rights. So what adjudication does is to use the courts, use judges to try to uphold the expectations that are most confidently and widely held, or at least should have been, right? And that relies on the precedent of previous legal decisions. And so that's the key here, is getting judges to sort of see what has been the verdict, what has been the ruling in the expectation in cases like this in the past. How does it apply here? But if there's no way to do that, right? If there's no answer to that question, then sometimes we have to go to legislation. And that's the creation of new rules, of new rights by government rather than the discovering of existing ones through judges. Legislation doesn't discover who has the property rights. It changes the prevailing property rights, sometimes by creating new ones, but sometimes by just altering, in fact, who has them. Okay? And one of the things that we might want to think about when we think about legislation is, the economists want to think about, is how do we do this in the least costly way, right? We just don't want to go around willy-nilly changing property rights, right? That's going to mess with exchanges and mess with people's expectations. So how do we do that in the way that uses the fewest resources? So we're going to talk about pollution reduction here, because that's the most obvious example. I mean, one thing we could do is just pass a law that says to each polluter to limit their pollution to a certain amount of pollution per period of time. You cannot produce more than 1 million particles of sulfur dioxide every year, something like that. The question, though, is why might this not be the least costly way to reduce pollution, right? We can use this sort of command and control technique where we put this maximum limit on firms. Why doesn't it necessarily the least costly way to do this? And the answer to that question is that not all firms have the same costs. Telling all the firms to reduce their pollution to a certain amount doesn't mean that it all costs the same for them to do it. For some firms, that's going to be easy to do, low cost. For other firms, it's going to be very costly. And one of the things to think about when we think about the cost of reducing pollution, there's two ways to think about it. The most obvious way is a firm has to perhaps go out and buy some new technology or redo its scrubbers and put a filter on or whatever it has to do, right? Our motorcyclist has to put a muffler on his motorcycle. All of those things are sort of the cost of the technology to reduce pollution. But there's another way to think about this too, which is to the degree that firms have to spend money on that, it makes the production of their output more expensive, right? This is a cost to them. It's going to reduce the supply. It's going to shift that supply curve to the left, which means some of the goods that they produce are lost to society. If we told Apple, right, that it had to produce iPhones and iPads in ways that were much more, say, much less polluting, and for them to do that, right, they have to invest resources in the production process. That means fewer iPads, fewer iPhones, and the ones that will be there, all the things equal, will be more expensive. So one way of measuring the cost of pollution reduction is it's an opportunity cost. It's goods that are foregone, right? Goods that the consumers don't get. So when we force firms to reduce their pollution, one of the ways of thinking about the cost of reducing pollution is we don't get as much stuff, right? Which is the flip side of them having to reallocate resources to the technology of pollution reduction. So that's one reason why we want to pay attention to cost, right? Okay, we want to think about what are the costs of asking firms to reduce. And if it's very expensive, that is, firms we want to cut their pollution who are either producing something that people really value or who would have to invest a lot of money in it to reduce that, technologically to reduce that pollution. There's some interesting questions we might say there. Do we really want to do that, right? And one of the alternatives we can think about, and the book discusses, I'm not going to talk about this, is sort of pollution trading and pollution permits and putting a tax on polluters, right? And one of the things about taxing polluters is it may turn out, right, for the lowest cost polluters, they're going to say, okay, it's just easier for us to spend the resources to reduce our pollution than it is to pay a tax. It's cheaper. But for the really high-cost reducers, right, for the people for whom reducing pollution would be very costly, they might just say, you know what, I'll pay the tax, right? It's easier and cheaper for me to pay the tax than it is to invest in the technology. And maybe the public doesn't want to lose the goods we're producing, so we'll just pay the tax. And again, normally the idea behind that tax is that then the resources from the tax get redistributed to the people who are harmed by the pollution. Okay. Now, whether or not it in fact works that way, that's the theory. Whether it works that way in practice is a really interesting question. Next chapter, chapter 11, we'll talk more about how politics works and why it doesn't always work that way. But here's the really fascinating question. Is that a problem? Is it a problem if someone says, look, my cost of reducing pollution is just greater than the tax, I'm just going to pay the tax? Isn't this economizing behavior? Aren't they saying that the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal costs here? Right? The ones who reduce their pollution because it's cheap to do so are saying the same thing. Is this a bad thing if firms say this? And one way to get at this, and this is where if you've got the PowerPoint with you want to look at slide number 8, which is the graph. The question we might ask is there an optimal quantity of pollution? Or better, is the optimal quantity of pollution not zero? Is it greater than zero? Right? Because when we're taught about pollution, we always think, well, we have to eliminate pollution. We have to get rid of all of it. That the optimal quantity of pollution is zero. But when you start to recognize that getting rid of pollution has costs associated with it, suddenly this looks different. Now, if you look at that graph, right, on the bottom there, it's the elimination. It's pollution reduction along the bottom, right? So the more of it that we reduce, the greater the benefits. And you can see the downward sloping curve there for marginal social benefits. But it's also the case that as we try to reduce pollution more and more, the marginal social costs rise. That is, the more we try to reduce pollution, the more we're spending on technology, the more outputs, valuable outputs we're giving up. I mean, we could reduce pollution to zero if we said no one's allowed to produce anything, right? That would reduce pollution to zero, but that's not a world we want to live in. So the question is, how do we value the goods that are being produced versus the value we attach to reducing pollution? We've got a trade-off here, right? And this is just basic economic way of thinking. Resources are scarce. If we want to devote resources to pollution reduction, how much do we devote, right? If we devote tons to it, what's the opportunity cost? What are we giving up? And what all of this suggests is that the optimal quantity of pollution is not zero, right? Go back to earlier. The optimal quantity of negative externalities was not zero. Some we just put up with, right? Because the costs of getting rid of them are too high. Same thing here, right? That the cost of getting rid of some pollution is simply too high, either in terms of the technology it would take or the output that we would give up by doing it, right? If we told Apple they had to have totally clean production, they couldn't produce iPads or iPhones anymore, that would be bad, right? We would probably say it's not worth it, okay? So again, the optimal quantity of pollution is not zero. Think of it this way. Is it worth it to squeeze out every last drop of air pollution, right? If the technology to do so is very expensive, or if the output we forego is very valuable. Don't we prefer having the valuable output or using those resources for something more important than we do squeezing out that last drop? Now, one thing to say here is we don't know exactly what that optimal quantity is. We're pretty sure it's not zero. But where it is depends upon how we value pollution reduction, what our estimate of the costs are. So I'm not making any claim about exactly where those two lines cross and what that number is. That's the complicated part that we try to figure out all the time. But what we know is it's not at zero, right? And if people say, the only rational policy is to eliminate pollution, right? That's a real violation of the economic way of thinking, not thinking in terms of the trade-offs and opportunity costs there. So let me mention the two other ways in which we can use economics to talk about the environment. One of those is something you might be familiar with, which is known as the tragedy of the commons, right? And you can see from my little picture in the PowerPoint, right? We can imagine a big open area, and we've got 4 farmers, and they've all got sheep, and they want to graze their sheep on this common land. So what's the problem here? The problem here is that they get the benefits if they graze their sheep on this land, but some of the cost of them adding an additional sheep onto the land is imposed upon the other shepherds because the additional sheep start to eat up some of the grazing land that their sheep might use. This is a congestion problem, right? Like driving on the freeway. So while each of the shepherds gets the benefits of their adding one sheep, the other people bear all the costs. Right, and eventually, what will happen, of course, is all the good grazing land will get eaten up, and that's the tragedy of the commons. Right, common areas like this will be overexploited. You can think, if you know anything about fisheries and fishing problems, right, this is another example of this as well. All right. So the tragedy of the commons is a long-standing concern. So how might we solve this problem here? Is there an easy, obvious solution to the shepherd problem? Hopefully, the one that comes to mind is we just divide up the commons into private property, right? Imagine just drawing 2 lines through there and making it into 4 squares, and now each shepherd has an equal part of the commons and can decide whether it's worth it or not. Because if they add another sheep and it's all fenced in, now, right, the cost of the sheep's grazing is borne only by the shepherd who adds the sheep. There's no external cost for the other shepherds. By the way, historically, barbed wire in the U.S., in the West, in the Old West, what barbed wire did was keep cattle from roaming onto other places and preventing this kind of tragedy of the commons from happening. Okay? So privatizing the commons is one way to do this. It internalizes the externality. It forces the choosers who put more sheep on to bear all the costs, right? And this is what ideally we'd like to be able to do, is to internalize, right, those negative externalities this way, right? You want to internalize the benefits of a positive externality or the cost of a negative externality as a way to reduce or eliminate them, right? One thing you might think about is if you've ever been to a drive-in movie, right? It looks like a big positive externality there. We're showing this big movie on a big public screen. But how do they prevent that positive externality? How do they internalize the benefits? They separate the sound, right? And you get the sound separately over the radio. In the old days, it was a speaker that hung on, right? And you can even think about how over-the-air TV and radio do this, right? Because you broadcast a TV show, everyone can get it. How do they ensure that people actually pay for it? And of course, advertising is the answer, right? The idea is that the advertisers pay the TV station, and hopefully what you do is buy the ads, buy the products that are being advertised, and so you eventually pay the advertisers back who pay the TV station, and that internalizes the positive externalities of over-the-air TV and radio. Okay, right? Cable doesn't have this problem because it's not over the air. Not everyone can grab it. You have to pay a subscription to Sirius XM versus over the air radio, right? That's why you don't hear advertisements on Sirius. You're already paying the $15 a month or whatever it is. Okay. So the tragedy of the commons, it's a potential problem, but if we can find ways to privatize the commons, and there's all kinds of clever examples about how you might do that, we can solve those problems. The third application is what I like to call the optimal rate of extraction. So with the optimal rate of extraction, this really isn't so much a negative externality problem, though there's a way to frame it that is, right? But it's because it is over time, but it's really an economizing problem for the firm. So imagine you are the owner of an oil company and you have an oil well, and you have to figure out how much of that oil you want to extract out, pull out of the well at any given point in time. You can think about this as like a strip mining question too, right? You own some land and you want to mine it and get the resources out of the land. Do you strip mine it? Do you just wipe it all out, right? Or do you slowly extract it over time? So to understand how to answer this question, we have to think, what are the marginal benefits? What are the marginal costs? All right, so what are the benefits of extracting the resource? Well, that seems obvious, right? You can pull the resource out, you can sell it, and when you sell it, you can take the proceeds, invest it, and earn interest. So one easy way to think about this is that the rate of interest is an indicator of what the benefit of extracting the resource will be. But what's the cost of extracting the resource? What do you give up if you try to pull out all the resource now? Well, like everything else, it's an opportunity cost. What's the opportunity cost? The price of that resource may go up over time, so the oil may get more expensive as time goes by. If you wait and don't extract it now, later on you'll have more valuable oil sitting there that you can sell for a higher price. So the cost here can be thought about as that price differential. And so the decision, right, that our oil well owner has to make is, if I extract today and earn the interest rate, will that be greater or less than what I expect the increase in price to be if I let it sit? And so uncertainty associated with this means in the real world, right, owners of oil wells, extract a certain amount per year. You could set up a nice little equation to show this, but we'll extract only a certain amount per year, trying to sort of cover themselves, right? Yeah, we want some interest return on the proceeds of selling it, but we also want to leave some in there, right? Because we have some confidence anyway that the price will go up later on. So the question is, why not extract it all out? Because all now, you might think at first, well, aren't they greedy bastards and they just want to take everything out and sell it now? But not if they can be greedy bastards, but if that's what they care about, leaving some in the ground makes sense too, right? One of the things to think about here, of course, is the role of property rights, right? Because that's the key to this, okay? The reason that those owners of the oil wells aren't going to extract now is because they're confident in their ownership rights over the oil and confident that those rights will continue into the future. Okay? Rules and institutions, the rules of the game matter a lot here, right? Because if you don't think you're going to own this thing down the road, if you're worried the government's going to come in and take it over, or the judges are going to undermine your property rights, or environmentalists or other activists are going to come in and make it harder for you to get the value of your oil in the future, you're going to want to extract it all now. I mean, that's the irony here, right? Is that attempting oftentimes to regulate this and tell oil company owners what they can do with their oil means it weakens their property rights, creates a greater incentive for them to actually not conserve the resource for the future. Right? The best way to conserve it is to make sure that people can trade it and sell it and use it down the road. That's what encourages them to keep the value. Right? If you're going to go, if you're thinking about selling your house, the last thing you want to do is trash it. You want to, because you own it and you're going to get the value of selling it, you want to make it look even better. That's why people, to try to flip houses and try to make changes and additions and add value before they sell it. It's theirs. It's because they own it, right? Same thing with a car, perhaps, right? When it's the things we don't own or the things where we think our property rights are weak, what's the problem? And so here's the thing, right? Strong property rights, clear, strong, well-defined property rights encourage conservation and prevent us from imposing costs on future generations by extracting all of that resource now. Okay? Private property rights are important here. They prevent the owners of non-renewable resources from externalizing their cost of over-extraction onto future generations. If they do that too quickly, if they take too much out now, they bear the cost because they lose the revenue they would make down the road, right? And private property, unlike what we sometimes hear, really does encourage people to think in terms of the long run, because if you own something, again, you can sell it down the road. So to recap this, both of these lectures, right? Externalities, especially negative ones, are pervasive. We can never eliminate them all, but some can can be reduced through negotiation and adjudication and well-designed legislation. Well-defined, secure, and enforced private property rights are a particularly effective way of ensuring that actors reap all the benefits and especially bear all the costs of their decisions. From the Coase theorem to privatizing the commons to understanding the importance of private property when we think about resource ownership, like the oil well, all of those things are really important. And so is the role of prices, right, in signaling to us how scarce something is, how valuable it will be down the road. Those are the key features of the market are really important for us to accomplish many of the goals that environmentalists have. And so one of the things that you might think a lot about here, right, is why it's often the case that environmentalists don't like markets and don't like capitalism and don't like private property and think that people will do environmental harm if they're left free to operate within the market. What are they missing, and what of this discussion that we've had in these two lectures would you want to say to them to sort of say, well, no, maybe you don't really understand it, okay? As we turn to Chapter 11 next week, we'll even reinforce this from another angle, thinking about what are the limits of legislation and government policy. But that'll be for Chapter 11. We'll leave Chapter 10 here.